Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, Southwest Sojourn, Grand Canyon, Bryce and Zion. Presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Kaden Dearing. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you for joining us here today. Take it away, Kaden.
Thank you, Rob. Afternoon, everybody, or in the morning, depending on where the world you come from. I should apologize in advance. I am outside currently, and wouldn't you know it, I'm actually in St. George, Utah, with my family this week, doing a little bit of personal travel. But we're going to be talking about this area, and if you happen to be one of those lucky people coming with us this summer or next fall, down here to the Bryce, Zion, and Grand Canyon tour. Will actually be going out of St. George. And so just getting a feel for this season and doing a little bit of personal travel. But I am outside and there's some birds. The migratory season is kicking it off here in Utah as well. And there's a couple kids playing in the pool. So hopefully you can hear me. But my name is Kaden Dearing, as Rob mentioned. I've been a expedition leader for Natural Habitat Adventures for just around 4 years now. Absolutely love it. I stumbled into the industry after finishing up schooling at Utah State University, where I studied cultural anthropology and religious studies, and was working a retail job when I got a call from an old boss. But I got my start in guiding back when I was 15 years old, guiding for the Boy Scouts of America in the backcountry of Yellowstone, in a place just right in between Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Parks. And I spent 8 summers there, basically since I was 15 years old, and worked my way back into guiding, as I mentioned, after graduating. And here I am, 4 years later, doing a lot in the Southwest, which is a wonderful thing for me to do. Obviously, I love spending time here on my days off as well. We just came back last week from the new Moab itinerary that Natural Habitat put out this year. Very excited about the itinerary. I would check it out if you're interested in this area of the world. 5 days, a little bit shorter than our previous trips, but we sure pack it in there. So we do Arches National Park, Canyonlands National Park, and a lot of the different areas around Moab, Utah. So opposite side of the state, but that same beautiful red rock sandstone and just beautiful silence out there in some of the most remote parts of the lower 48. So definitely check that out. But today we're talking about a more classic adventure. I think it's about 8 days down here out of St. George, and we'll get going here. I should mention I also guide not only here in the Southwest, I guide in Yellowstone in the wintertime, as well as Glacier National Park and Acadia National Park in the summer and fall. So I do work for NatHab full time, and as I mentioned, it is a pleasure to be here with you all today. So let's get going here. As Rob mentioned, Southwest Sojourn, Grand Canyon, Bryce, and Zion is what we're going to be talking about today. Basically, what my presentation is going to be is an overview of the trip. I'll talk a little bit about itinerary things. Get everyone excited and hyped for this itinerary to come out with us this summer. I think our first departure is going to be here in the end of May, and we'll be going through June, and then, of course, in the fall. But anyway, we'll get underway. We'll get into that. I'm getting ahead of myself here. First, a quote by Edward Abbey. Edward Abbey, of course, is a very famous, one of the most famous Southwest writers. And this is from Desert Solitaire. The wind will not stop. Gusts of sand swirl before me, stinging my face. But there is still too much to see and marvel at. The world is very much alive in the bright light and wind, exultant with the fever of spring, the delight of morning. Strolling on, it seems to me that the strangeness and the wonder of existence are emphasized here in the desert by the comparative sparsity of existence, of flora and fauna, life not crowded upon life as in other places, but scattered abroad in sparseness and simplicity, with a generous gift of space for each herb and bush and tree, each stem of grass, so that the living organism stands out brave and bold and vivid against the lifeless sand and barren rock. The extreme clarity of the desert light is equaled by the extreme individuation of desert life forms. Love flowers best in openness and freedom. I love it. I think that kind of sets the tone for the time that I've spent in the desert Southwest all throughout my life, and really the tone we try to set on all of our trips out here. I would add that the sand to me and the rock are not lifeless by any means, but full of life. Um, really excited about this itinerary. St. George is a little busy, I will say. Uh, every time I come down here, I've been coming down here since I was 8 years old, and there seems to be more and more popping up, but we sure get out of it quickly, out into the remote parts of the area. Setting the stage here, we're talking about the Colorado Plateau. This is a giant heart-shaped raised piece of land that covers more or less the Four Corners area of the United States. There on my graphic here, my little map, you can see on the far left is a little star. That's right where I'm sitting. That's St. George, Utah, southwest corner of the state, just about an hour up from Las Vegas. So we do have folks that tend to fly in there. A little bit more convenient for a couple of folks. But we're sitting at the cross sections of three very important ecosystems in the desert Southwest. As you can see, the brown outline in this map in particular is the Colorado Plateau. This is high desert, up typically above 6,000 feet. So up in Bryce Canyon, we do get up to about 9,000 feet of elevation. I'm talking a high elevation desert. But as you can see, St. George is situated right on the left corner of the Colorado Plateau. So you have the cross sections of three large ecosystems. Just to the north, up towards the Great Salt Lake in the western half of the state of Utah, is what's called the Great Basin Desert. And this is characterized by large north to south running mountain ranges separated by these large basins. And a basin is not only a fun word, but a geologic term for a place where water does not exit. So as you can see, the Colorado Plateau is more or less the large drainage for the Colorado River. The Great Basin Desert, the water goes nowhere, just like the Great Salt Lake. It flows out of the mountains and then sits down in the basin area before it evaporates and moves away. And that is the large feature of that desert. Of course, as you move further south, you kind of cross the Grand Canyon and southwest down into Death Canyon, southern Nevada, southeastern California, and northwestern Arizona. That is the Mojave Desert. And that's going to be a lot more of your typical, very sand-swept, of a lot of Gila monsters, a lot of cacti species down there in the Mojave. And so really a beautiful leaping off point down here in St. George of some really nice cross sections of flora and fauna. A lot of different, sometimes we pop up to the botanical garden in town, or if you get in early, then you'll have the opportunity to do that and see just the plethora of different species of plants that we get in this area. Really, really fun spot for a jumping off point. But we will be spending quite a bit of time up on the Colorado Plateau. So immediately as we leave town that first day up to Bryce Canyon, we're going to be hopping up pretty high elevations. So these are things to keep in mind. This isn't I would say an overly active trip. I think our longest hike is just about 3 miles, but that is up at 7,000 feet of elevation. And just as it's on the mind, I had a couple of folks out in Moab earlier this week, and it is a little bit more of a hiking intensive trip out there. And they were deeply surprised as they were coming from Huntington Beach and all sorts of different places, saying, I do 4 or 5 miles a day. Well, up at 7,000 feet, it's a big difference, especially as it gets hotter and more dried out as the summer goes on. So if this is something you're looking forward to, definitely, get moving because you'll want to see. I mean, there's so many beautiful things to see, and most of it, as I mentioned, is walkable and perfectly able to do it, but it is high up. Colorado Plateau, beautiful place. And I'm getting ahead of myself again. A couple of details here. As I mentioned, 8 days. Most of our trips range from about 10 to 13 people. I will say I do have a trip this summer that is a low bookings, I think, this year. I'm not quite sure why, but I do have 7 folks, and I will be guiding them myself. So if we do have 7 or less, it is one guide, one vehicle for the whole trip, but typically we're around 10 to 13, 2 guides, 2 vehicles, and that is the cap for sure. So nice small tour. We're not going to be on a bus of 50 people, which really keeps things nice and intimate. But I will read this language here, as I mentioned, in regards to hiking and physical requirements for the trip. Rated easy to moderate. This adventure does not require a high degree of physical fitness. However, in order to participate, travelers should be able to walk at least 2 miles unassisted over uneven terrain and inclines. And uneven terrain and inclines, what that means in this part of the world is what we call slick rock. And slick rock, contrary to the name, is not slick at all. It's actually just compact sandstone that you're walking on. So it's almost like 150 grade sandpaper. I always have to throw that caveat in. Everyone says slick rock. Oh my goodness, I'm going to die. No, not quite that bad. But it is uneven. There's undulations in the ground, so you want, I usually recommend high ankle support on your boot is a good option out here. To keep your ankles and your knees, nice and steady. Some altitude gain, and altitudes up to 9,115 feet above sea level. So I'm talking, that's the very, very tip top of Bryce Canyon National Park. And we won't be doing too much hiking up at 9,000 feet, but I will say up at about 8,000 is where our 3-mile hike is going to be. And with a significant drop off the rim there. But that is our best hike, I would say. That is through the hoodoos of Bryce Canyon National Park. Oftentimes one of the highlights of the trip for a lot of people. So that's not something you want to be missing out on for this one. An optional mule ride. I will say we did have a pretty large accident last year on the mule ride, so we're going to hold off on that one for this year and maybe reconsider some other options. We will be doing some hiking rather than that mule ride up on the Grand Canyon, so I apologize. I have not updated this presentation. A couple of those mule rides slipped past me. So no mule ride. As I mentioned, a couple of difficulties with that this last year. But definitely some opportunities to do extensive walking and some beautiful scenic locations there on the north rim of the Grand Canyon. Most of the trip takes place in an arid desert environment, and the sun can often be intense, especially as you're getting later in the season. We do not run these trips in July and August, which I think is a boon. You're getting 110 degrees consistently in this area of the world in those times of the year nowadays. So, we're mostly running May and June, and then September and October is kind of our season here. Days generally start quite early, are full of activities, including few long drives. I'll go over drive times here in a minute. While travelers are not required to participate in all activities, should you opt out of the day's scheduled activities, we cannot always guarantee that alternatives will be available. So as I mentioned, definitely prepare, and definitely worth it if you're coming out to this part of the world to do that 3-mile hike. And so things to keep in mind. I always tell everyone, altitude training is really difficult to do unless you're at altitude. So, if you've got some kind of hill close to where you live and you do some incline training on that hill, running on a treadmill is really not going to do it for you. Again, just some heavy language today for me comes because of that Moab trip. Everyone was able to do all the hikes last week, I will add, but definitely a little bit of sweat was had last week. A couple of photos to get everyone excited. This is a really rare view of the north rim of the Grand Canyon. Not something you typically see on your regular Grand Canyon view. I took this photo personally a couple years ago. This is actually an inversion layer on the top of the Grand Canyon. Really, really, really pretty. If the clouds weren't there, you could see down. But this is really typical. A lot of folks have gone to the south rim of the Grand Canyon, and you don't get this type of forest growth on the south rim. So you can see a couple of the aspens changing there. I think this was the first week of October a couple of years ago. And a lot of those big conifers, so a lot of ponderosa pine, really large trees. And this is what we're going to be looking at the north rim. Like I said, a lot of tour companies do go to the south rim because it's a lot easier to get to. And so north rim is really well known for a lot of solitude, a lot of quiet, but still pristine, gorgeous views. And as I mentioned, a really robust forest up there. Another beautiful photo here, a little bit washed out from what I can see, but hopefully y'all can see it. This is actually sunrise at Bryce Canyon National Park, one of my favorite photos from a couple of years ago. Those beautiful hoodoos, this is one of the highlights of the trip. We are going to be spending some time doing some sunrises and hopefully some sunsets weather pending. But some nice photography happening there. One of my favorite activities. And of course, this is a really famous view of Zion. This is actually looking out of the canyon. So the canyon is behind me in this photo. But as you can see, the Virgin River meandering along the desert floor there. The Watchman, which is that large peak off in the distance. This is about sunset time. We'll spend some time there getting some beautiful photos. But Zion National Park really is an oasis because of that beautiful river in the desert. These three parks, they are, within 2-hour drive of each other respectively, but there's so much to see, and everyone is constantly surprised at the variation of really sandstone in most instances in all these places, but the many forms that it takes is just stunning. So a couple of activities, as I mentioned, helicopter ride. Actually, I haven't mentioned, but a couple of activities up at Bryce Canyon. We do have a helicopter ride around the rim. The Bryce Canyon Airport's a cute little airport. It's got this big log cabin, one of the oldest log hangars still left within the U.S. Really wonderful. It's been family run since the inception, probably over 80 plus years now. They did just sell this last year to another local group of people, but really nice, beautiful helicopter ride. One of the highlights of the trip. As I mentioned, the Queen's Garden Loop. This is that really nice hike up at Bryce Canyon, 3 miles, 650 feet up and down. You're getting into the hoodoos, right? So we're walking through the maze. And as the light changes throughout the day, and as we move through this beautiful place, it really is a highlight. That's going to be something to keep in mind. That is the longest hike of the trip. So that's kind of your benchmark right there. 3 miles, 650 feet up and down. And as I mentioned, just about 8,000 feet up in elevation. Rainbow and Yavimpa points, we do go out there. That's that 9,100 high point. We do a little bit of walking, but this is on paved kind of viewpoint pathways. And so nothing too strenuous up there, but really nice views up at essentially the top of the Grand Staircase. And the Grand Staircase is something we'll talk a lot about on trip, but it is, basically the top of Bryce Canyon of rock that's about, 50 million years old, all the way down to the bottom of the Grand Canyon, where you're looking at about 1.5 billion year old rock and everything in between. This giant staircase of geologic layers that will start up there at Rainbow and Yavimpa Point. Hoodoos, that's what we're talking about. This is a beautiful view of what's called the Thor's Hammer. As you can see, the top of this central hoodoo in the photo here. That is probably the most photographed hoodoo, but these are these large stone pillars that Bryce Canyon National Park is very famous for. This is up in the Claron Formation, as I mentioned. These really nice, if you can look at the sandy slope beneath it, really nice color gradients moving through this landscape. This is all, of course, siltstone deposited by ancient lakes. But this is what we're going to be walking through, this beautiful maze of hoodoos. Won't get too much into that, but a little taste of what we're going to be looking at. A couple of wildlife features up there at Bryce Canyon National Park. Up left there, that is the endangered Utah prairie dog. There are some prairie dog towns that are pretty prominent there at the drive into Bryce Canyon. Talk about those fellas, what they're doing up there at the top of the plateau in the desert. And some grassland features will hopefully, depending on the time of year, be able to, I would say, usually they do go to bed about mid-October. But at the start of the season, we do get to see those fellas and talk about them, get some nice close views. And if anyone's familiar with the second fastest land animal on the planet, bottom right there, that is the American pronghorn or antelope. Silver streak of the high plateau, we'll get to see some of those critters as well. Moving on to Zion National Park. So this is the order with which we will do the trip. As I mentioned, leaving St. George that first day, driving all the way up to Bryce Canyon with a couple of stops in between. I won't give you the entire itinerary, but just some big highlights of the trip. Moving on down through Zion National Park, we do have that 1 mile out and back Virgin River walk. This is, of course, on paved path. It does move up and down a little bit. I would say maybe about 100 feet up and down, give or take. But it is a really nice, beautiful pathway to walk along the Virgin River that morning, get some nice views. It can be a little bit crowded, but definitely worth and probably one of the most iconic spots to be in Zion National Park. Emerald Pools hike, that is our optional afternoon hike. We might have depending on the guide, there's a lot of variability in this itinerary in regards to the mobility of the beach. Excuse me, the particular group of folks that are out with us that week. But this is one of those options that I do like to take advantage of. The Emerald Pools hike is about 2.5 miles or 1.5, depending on if you go to the upper and upper pools, kind of an addition if you're feeling particularly spry that day. But it is 600 feet up and down. It used to be a much, much shorter hike, but back in 2023, we had, of course, had that record in the state of Utah, and that flood of the Virgin River actually took out the old bridge. And so we do go on this longer pathway. Again, I do always like to encourage people this afternoon in Zion. It is kind of about the midpoint of the trip. And so if we're staying in the canyon, it is a wonderful time to just kind of hang out and enjoy. We do spend sometimes some departures we do spend out in Springdale, which is just at the mouth of the canyon at the hotel there. It is a much nicer hotel. Zion Lodge has been struggling the last couple of years with management. We do have a new concessionaire this year in the Zion Lodge, and so we'll see kind of how that goes. They are a smaller company and hopefully a little bit more detail oriented. But as I mentioned, a great time to spend the afternoon doing some various things, spending some time in town, or just enjoying the canyon from wherever you are. That's what I encourage everyone to do. The Peruche Trail, that was where I took that photo earlier that I showed you of the sunset on the Watchman. That is a nice little trail that kind of meanders up and above the Virgin River there, and is pretty quiet. So we'll spend some time out there as well. Just a little bit of a walk. Zion National Park, there's a nice view. Zion is notoriously difficult to photograph, I will say. There are a couple of points where you can get a nice wide view. I do enjoy this one here on the left. As you can see, this beautiful green, lush valley, surrounded by 2,000-foot tall sandstone cliffs. Just stunning. We'll play around if you're a photographer, you play around with those wide angles and try to get some nice light there. But it is a little bit of a fun challenge because of those 2,000-foot tall sandstone cliff faces. We do get a number of endemic species. One of them being here on the right. This is called a Zion shooting star, and this particular wildflower only grows in Zion National Park. Really wonderful. Definitely a boon of coming in the springtime. Obviously, in the fall, you're not going to get so much wildflower action, but kind of depending on the water levels, early June is going to be really nice for wildflowers. I will say, right now in southern Utah, we're sitting at about a 50% of average snowpack, so it is going to be a drier year, and that always does kind of fluctuate when spring occurs. My allergies have really been kicking off this week, so it might be pretty early this year. A couple of other critters we might spot. Actually, probably the most consistent there on the left. That's a desert bighorn sheep. Of course, the drier land cousin of the Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep. A little bit thinner, a little bit better adapted to the space we're at. As you can see, they really love that low angle sandstone. That's that slick rock I was talking about. Really wonderful climbers. They were reintroduced into Zion, back in the 80s. So it's been a minute, and they are booming. They're doing so well. They've actually started, because they're afraid of the bighorn population coming in contact with native sheep populations and a little bit of disease transfer happening. They're actually starting to transport a large number of these bighorn sheep to other parts of the state to repopulate wilderness areas. So really wonderful success story of the conservation of those bighorn sheep that we'll hopefully get a chance to see. There on the right, that is a canyon tree frog. Again, a nice resident. You can see them year-round, but definitely during kind of the breeding season in the early springtime, you can hear these guys, and they actually sound like sheep. They do kind of this bleating sound along the creek beds. And so another little critter to keep your eye out for. Moving on to the Grand Canyon. Grand Canyon National Park, as we mentioned, the North Rim. The North Rim, the reason our season is actually pretty short is because the North Rim closes up usually until about mid-May or end of May. And that's because the North Rim sits at about 8,000 feet, and it gets a significant amount of snow in the wintertime. And so that North Rim Lodge is seasonal, and that whole road is actually seasonal as far as opening. And so I'm pretty sure it'll be open a little bit sooner here, this year. Um, but definitely worth your time. Even if you have been to the South Rim, the North Rim is a totally different experience. We'll do a nice remote sunrise experience. This is, again, I mean, there's so many highlights of this trip. I love this itinerary. But the place that we have for sunrise there at the North Rim is a spectacular location. It does take a little bit of an early rise, in that early season. Sometimes we end up getting up at about 3 or 4 a.m. But I promise you, it is well worth it. It is a beautiful remote location, and sunrise on the Grand Canyon is something that you only experience maybe, once or a couple of times if you're lucky in your life. It is a beautiful time. Again, sorry about the language on the mule ride. That one's not happening. And I will say most people who have done the mule ride in the last couple of years have complained. It is definitely harder if you're not a frequent horse or a horse rider. Then you do get rather saddle sore. And so I am excited to kind of have another option as far as rim hikes or maybe down below the rim, just walking. And so I'm not too bummed about the lack of a mule ride, but yes, make sure that we remember that. And as I mentioned, a rim hike, there's a couple of different options that we've done over the years, kind of depending on mobility and everything, but a nice hike up along the top there. There is a beautiful hike that goes out onto one of these points if you're not too afraid of heights. It is a really nice walk out there as well. But some nice time spent there at the North Rim, checking out a lot of the different places. And maybe a little bit of a breakfast on the rim at a remote location. You didn't hear it from me. A couple of critters we're going to see up there. We have a chance of seeing. Of course, I do never guarantee a wildlife sighting. But we do spend some time down there. If anyone's familiar with the California condor, again, another wonderful conservation story. California condors mostly exist, of course, in California. And somewhere around 350 individuals, if I remember correctly, maybe up to 400 now. They are rather slow breeders, so it is a long process. And then there is a population of condors as well of about 96, I want to say, last year's total. We did lose about 16 birds to the avian flu. They are rather social, so that was quite a blow to the population here. But there are a good number of birds that travel often, occasionally we do see them in Zion National Park, but they do roam around that north rim of the Grand Canyon area. Beautiful, beautiful birds. We'll actually get down with a couple of folks. So it's the Peregrine Fund, which is the nonprofit that's in charge of the California Condor Restoration Project. And we do get a chance to go down to their release site or just below the cliff of their release site. So it's a little bit off in the distance and get to talk to those folks about what's going on with their project. So that was actually added last year and a great addition to the itinerary of a local conservation project. So definitely those birders, if you're excited about condors, come on out. Down there on the right, this is an interesting looking ground squirrel. This is called a kaibab ground squirrel. So it's the Kaibab Plateau that's there on the north rim of the Grand Canyon. And it is a little bit of an island ecosystem. As you probably imagine, the south side is a little bit restrictive with a couple 1,000-foot drop down to the river. But then on the north side, it's all basically desert. And so you get a little bit of another, endemic species there of the plateau. I haven't seen too many of these guys, but they do live up on the treetops and they're around. Other locations, with the big three there, I always like to mention there are national parks, but these are a couple of additions that we have an opportunity to go to as well. Kodachrome Basin State Park. I was born and raised in the beautiful state of Utah. I never heard about this place until we started coming here with NatHab. And I absolutely do not regret it. It is a gem of a state park. Utah does a really good job of managing it. It is way out there into a remote location, just about 45 minutes to an hour drive from our Bryce Canyon lodging. And it is gorgeous. As you can see, Kodachrome Basin kind of comes from that really iconic red rock right beneath the top of that white rock there, and a couple of some really interesting geologic features out there. Really wonderful. We'll be able to do a little walk out in Kodachrome. And then just outside of St. George here, I was actually just there yesterday, rock climbing with my brothers. Snow Canyon State Park. Again, really wonderful. You can see that red rock and white rock up there. A local spot where we'll be able to kind of poke our heads maybe into a little bit of a slot canyon, introduce everyone to the ecosystem of the Mojave Desert, and talk a lot about red rock formation, sandstone formation. This park in particular kind of sits right in between, as I mentioned, the Great Basin and the Mojave. So you get some really cool species interchange of a lot of the flora you can't find anywhere else in the state. Really beautiful spot. Yeah, and then we're going to move on to kind of some logistics. So many of you who've been on a NatHab trip before are probably pretty familiar. A lot of this is going to be pretty similar. I'm going to try to just talk mostly about trip specifics in regards to the nitty-gritty logistics. We'll go over climate and weather, packing tips, arrivals and departures, money, vehicles, accommodations, food, ethics, that kind of thing. So as I mentioned, again, I can't harp on this enough. Elevation is going to be your big limiting factor. I always tell everyone, not only is it hot and we're high up, but it's dry. I have just kind of, again, I'm from northern Utah. And so coming back down to the south, it dries me out even now. And I can tell I need some lotion on my hands as we speak. But definitely in gearing up to this trip, hydration is going to be your key. Please drink lots of water. That's going to be your number one defender against altitude sickness, and it's going to make you feel a lot better as you're moving around in the heat of the summer. Wide brim hats. We'll talk about packing, but in regards to elevation, lots and lots of water. And we are experts at finding every single bathroom that the desert has to offer. So please don't hold back on drinking the water. Zion, we do to get a drop down, that next day about 4,000 feet. It is a nice change up, helps us to kind of acclimatize again, and then back up to the North Rim at about 8,000 feet. So things to keep in mind. Climate and weather, as I mentioned, dry heat. Because of the lack of moisture content in the soil and on the landscape in general, you get large temperature swings between the night and the daytime. You might wake up to a 35-degree morning, and by the afternoon it gets up to about 70 degrees or 80 degrees, right? And so it's going to be big temperature swings in regards to that. Sometimes in the early season, end of May, we get a little bit of snow lingering at the top of Bryce Canyon. So, I don't tell people to bring large coats or anything like that, but maybe a thermal layer or two might help you on those early mornings, especially that cold morning in Bryce and maybe at the Grand Canyon. And so things to keep in mind. Definitely check the weather. Zion is rather temperate. They do sit down rather much lower, and down there by the river kind of levels things out. But they do, as I mentioned, the temperatures range from about 40, maybe 50s in the morning to up to 80s or 90s. And we do not go in July and August because it is so hot. Lots and lots of sunshine. And that gets us into, packing for clothing, right? We're going to talk about layers. So as I mentioned, if we're going to be starting early in the morning, you're going to maybe want to be starting out with, a thermal layer on your bottoms, nice thick socks, nice thick pants, and a nice sweat wicking layer. I kind of have this, this is actually wow, big brain fart. Anyway, a sweat wicking layer. I'm trying to think of the name of the material and I can't even. And then a nice fleece in between, and it can get windy up at those high elevations, and so a rain shell or some kind of windbreaker is going to be your best friend. I have here starred a sun hoodie. If anyone is, I don't have one on me, unfortunately, but if anyone's not familiar with what a sun hoodie is, please look into it. This is going to be your base layer, so it's a nice full length sleeve that sometimes has thumb holes to cover the back of your palm. That has a nice hood and is generally comes all the way down to your waist as well. This is a wonderful base layer for the desert. I bought one several years ago, and now I have two or three because they are so useful. So I definitely look into a sun hoodie, and what you want is a nice breathable layer. Some of those cheaper ones kind of tend to hold the flavor in, as I mentioned, and you're going to be sweating. And so a nice, as in regards to brands, of course, not affiliated with anyone, but Cool, Kuhl, is the brand I use for a sun hoodie. Something to look into. Sun hat, I do wear a nice wide brimmed wool hat or a nice lighter layer like your Tilly is going to be a wonderful thing, nice and ventilated sun hat. Of course, sunglasses are a must. Chums or like some kind of sunglass holder that sticks onto the end there is going to be nice for those windy days. Lightweight, breathable pants, light colors. You're not going to be wearing lots of black, obviously because of the sun. And as I mentioned, lightweight boots or hiking shoes, and you want to break them in. It is uneven terrain on a lot of these hikes, and so that ankle support is going to be big for you. Definitely recommend if you're a boots person, bring those boots. Going to keep trucking here, running out of time. Luggage. So many of you, as I mentioned, if you've traveled with NatHab before, you're familiar with kind of our luggage system. You'll have a day pack, some kind of backpack you can bring that is provided by. You might get from NatHab or any kind of backpack you prefer. I like this Osprey here at the top. 20 liters is probably just going to be good enough for you. And those will be all the things that you need for the daytime. So sunscreen, water bottle, camera, money, layers, extra socks, medications, all those things that you're going to need from every day from about 8 in the morning till about 4 in the afternoon. And then that check bag, because we will be moving locations 3 different times throughout the trip, is going to be all those other things that you have, your other layers, maybe an extra pair of shoes, all that other stuff will go into your check bag. And you won't have access to that throughout the day. And so things to keep in mind. Hiking poles, binoculars, and wildlife viewing scopes will be provided by Natural Habitat. If you have a particular pair of binoculars, you're a big birder, and you want to bring those out, feel free to. You're more than welcome. I always bring my own pair. So arrivals and departures. Most guests, as I mentioned, do come through St. George Airport. Small airport. I think they have 4 gates. And most, if I remember correctly, there are only 3 different. I think they take in planes from Salt Lake City, Phoenix, and maybe Denver. Definitely Salt Lake and Phoenix. But it is a small airport, so if that's something you're not super interested in, we do pick folks up the day of from St. George Airport, but if it's easier from your particular location where you live to fly into Las Vegas, it is only an hour ride up from Vegas into St. George, and there is a shuttle. So the St. George shuttle can be booked from the Las Vegas airport up to St. George. And so that is an option for folks if that's a little bit easier, money-wise or, travel time-wise that day. And I will say for those folks flying into St. George Airport, it is a little bit of distance from town. There's not food there, so definitely eat before you get to the airport. And then, as I mentioned, day one, all those folks arriving day one, either on the shuttle from Las Vegas or from the St. George Airport, they will be picked up by your expedition leader and transported to the hotel. If you're interested in coming in a little bit earlier, then you will be responsible for that day travel. And then again, we will circle all the way back around from the North Rim of the Grand Canyon to St. George or the St. George shuttle down to Las Vegas for departures. Money, I always mention, we will work with a number of different contractors throughout the trip, helicopter pilots, housekeeping, a lot of folks, waiting on us at restaurants, and all those gratuities will be administered by your expedition leader or your field operations specialist to the highest of the industry standard. We value these people that we work with in this area. We've had longstanding relationships with, and we do take care of them. The only tipping that you need to worry about is your expedition leaders. And the guidelines for all these things are in that pre-departure briefing. So if you are booked, you will receive a little bit of a pamphlet that has all this information and even more before your departure. Of course, if you do want to bring money out for souvenirs and books, feel free to. Most places do take a credit card. Actually, all of them do take a credit card. I can guarantee that. And then our vehicles. Again, please ignore the mule ride there. But this is our helicopter there on the top right. Beautiful view of the Western Temple of Zion in the background, which is nice. Bottom right is not the vehicle we're going to be traveling with. That was an old one from a couple of years. Man, I really need to update this. Apologies. But the bottom left, of course, is our Mercedes Sprinter van. And we are going to be using our new North American safari vehicles on this itinerary. So if you can imagine on the top of that Sprinter van, an entire piece of the roof that actually lifts up on hydraulics. Really, really fun. You can stand up on your seat on one of these big black containers that we have there in the vehicle and actually view from the top. Of course, this is wildly applicable in Yellowstone, kind of depending on where we're pulling over and what we're looking at. We'll use them on and off here in the Southwest. But a wonderful resource for us. These are nice new vehicles, just about a year old, and so nice and comfortable. And as I mentioned, rule number one for NAHAB is you'll never go hungry. And I'll get into that in a second. But rule number two is that everyone gets a window seat. So we do have two of these vehicles. They each fit 8 people. And so with a 13 people trip, everyone gets a nice view. And if your expedition leader is not cleaning those windows, you let them know. Okay, I'm sure they will be. And things to keep in mind, travel time in the desert does seem to extend. These are some driving times for those. Of course, we'll be making all sorts of scenic stops, for lunch and for other meaningful stops along the way. But these are those total driving times, not to catch you off guard. Traveling between places. St. George to Bryce is 2 hours. Bryce to Zion, hour and a half. Zion to the North Rim, 2 hours, 45 minutes. Again, meaningful stops along the way. Plenty of bathrooms. North Rim to St. George Airport, 2 hours, 50 minutes. So significant driving times, but definitely covering a lot of landscape in a short period of time. Beautiful accommodations here. Top left, that's the Bryce Canyon Lodge. This is one of those, advent of the National Park Service back in the 19-teens, 1920s. Most of these were built. Bryce Canyon Lodge, beautiful place, nice little cabins. Sorry, excuse me, not the cabins. Those are at the North Rim Lodge. But nice accommodations, hotel rooms that have been there historically, right close to the rim there. Top right, that is the Zion Lodge. Again, some departures staying there. If that's a priority for you, make sure you double check on that. Your other accommodations are there on the bottom left. Definitely nothing to turn your nose up at. Look at that view. That is the Spring Hill Suites in Springdale, just outside of the park. Beautiful spot. Definitely a nicer hotel, I would say. Maybe just the con of staying outside the park. And then there on the right, this is the North Rim Lodge, almost like a castle. Again, nice historic lodge there, right on the rim. And as you can see, built out of the Kaibab limestone, which is that same layer at the top of the Grand Canyon. So it blends in beautifully, really beautiful views. Even going to the lodge, if we weren't hiking anywhere, would be well worth the visit. Yeah. Moving on, food's great. Three of my favorite restaurants that we get to eat at for all of my guiding trips are here on this itinerary. So make sure all your dietary restrictions are communicated to NatHab. We've really been placing a priority on making sure everyone gets plenty of good food that are well within their dietary restrictions. So please communicate that, not only with NatHab, but when you get in the field, and if you have severe allergies especially, confirm with your staff. They will have that paperwork on them, but those are things to keep in mind for sure. Group travel ethics, of course, we're going to move by our leave no trace principles, which are plan and prepare, travel on impacted surfaces, leave what we find, respect wildlife, and be courteous to other visitors. I do mention, the North Rim and Bryce Canyon are rather limited. They do feel rather intimate. There's not a ton of people generally up there, though more every year. Zion can get a little, it is one canyon, right, up and down. And so there can be a couple of folks there. It is a beautiful national park, definitely worth it, but is conscious, to be mindful of others visiting as well. If you're a smoker, more than, we don't usually get a lot of smokers on these trips, but if you are, just let us know, and we can find you a good place to do that, well away from other guests and vehicles. And then, of course, as I mentioned, if you can think back to that Edward Abbey quote, the reason we're in the desert is to experience the beautiful peace that exists out here. And one of the beautiful things is that you're not going to have phone service for maybe large sections of the trip. And that is definitely, one of my favorite parts of my job, I'll say. And so let's try to limit the phone usage. If you do have important calls, of course, please take them. We'll find you some time to do that. But especially as we're moving through the landscape in the vehicles and on the trails, we just ask that you limit those things. And we're going to avoid touchy conversational topics. There's a lot going on right now politically in this country that not only I'm sure every single one of you have strong feelings about, but I do as well. And we're not going to be out here to be talking about those things. We're going to be out here to find common ground and enjoying these beautiful places that we preserved in this country. And so we're just going to leave aside a lot of those, touchy conversational topics, religion and politics. I will add the caveat, I did grow up in the state, and I am of the common heritage of many of Utahns. So we might hit on Mormonism, and we might talk about, public land management of these places. But those are very relevant and very contextualized in that regard. Health and safety. This is something Annette has asked me to share with you all. If you become ill on your adventure, whether with COVID-19 or another illness, you and our team will consult with a healthcare professional for next steps. If, at the recommendation of the medical professional, you are asked to test for COVID, you will be required to do so. Not super common nowadays. Now, but a positive COVID-19 test result, whether you take it at the recommendation of a medical professional or at your own discretion, will result in removal from the trip. In the case of necessary removal from the trip, our team will provide support for medical assistance and or logistics for your return trip home. Again, not required to take a test the vast majority of the time. If you choose to do so and it does, then you will be asked to go home. But 98% of the time, of course, we're not going to be administering those tests, and it will be treated as the flu, and we will take necessary precautions. You will not be required to leave the trip, but you may be asked, to sit separately from us at mealtimes. Maybe if you're comfortable with wearing a mask in the van, it will be, of course, situational dependent. But we do ask, we do not want, if someone gets sick, to spread it to the entire group and ruin, the vacation of several people. And so that we take necessary precautions within the realm that is reasonable on these trips to keep everybody safe, happy, and healthy. And that's all I'll say about that. Here we are. Another beautiful view of the Grand Canyon. This is a later in the day when the inversion picked up, but that is right from the North Rim Lodge. So definitely something to be excited about. I appreciate you all coming and listening to me today. I think it's back to you, Rob.
All right, Kaden, thank you so much. Now, before we dive into the questions, I would like to remind everyone that if you do have questions, feel free to submit them into the question field in your control panel. Just go to the top right corner. You'll see those three lines. Click on that and go down to questions, and that's where you can insert your question. All right, so let's get to these questions. So, can you tell us why we have to get up so early for sunrise? Is there a long drive or is it a long hike?
I was expecting that one. No, so early in the season, sunrises are getting earlier. So I will say May and June, 6 a.m. sunrise, not uncommon. As I mentioned, so the North Rim has a lot to do with the makeup of the North Rim of the Grand Canyon. The South Rim, because of the way that it has eroded over the years, is very flat. So if you look at the rim from a topographical map, you can drive along it in one straight line and see all the different points. Now, the North Rim, because of the way that it has eroded, is very peninsula shaped. So you have the North Rim Lodge on this large out-jutting, and then to get to the next point, you drive up and around to the next point, right? And this is kind of how the North Rim is shaped. And so to get out to my favorite place, and on the North Rim that is very remote, quiet, and beautiful, it does take about an hour and a half drive that morning, and then a little bit of a walk. So, as I said, definitely worth it. Highlight of the trip. It takes a little bit of time to get out there. So that is why we get up a little early. But that's, seasonally dependent. You go in September, it's going to be a little bit later of a sunrise for you.
Gotcha. Thank you for clarifying that, Kaden. So, can you talk about the difficulty of the hikes? Are we going to be walking fast? Do I need to be in really good shape? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mentioned I harped on the elevation piece big time. That's as I mentioned, our big one's going to be up at Bryce Canyon, 8,000 feet up in the air. We do have plenty of time to do this hike, so if you're interested and you're okay with going at a steady pace, we're not going to be, trail running these hikes by any means. We do have lots of time, and of course, two guides to kind of spread out. And I like to do what's called the accordion method, where our group might expand and it might contract throughout the day and expand and contract. Plenty of time to do that. But still at the same time, I think, you know, 95% of NatHab guests are definitely able of doing this hike. It just has a matter to do with a little bit of conditioning. You know, you need to get out there and do some walking for sure if you're planning on joining us there.
Gotcha. Thank you. What about mule rides? Is that something that is available to us?
Um, if you are specifically interested in doing the mule ride, um, that is something that I would say you communicate to your expedition leader at the beginning of the week. If that's something that you're determined to do, I will say the reason we've cut this, as I mentioned, there was someone who was seriously injured last year on one of our NatHab trips, and it wasn't anything to do with the mule. It wasn't anything to do with the contracting company. It had everything to do with this specific physical abilities of this specific guest. But because of some other large decision making that's a little bit above my head, we have cut it from the large amount of the trip. However, if like I said, if you are specifically interested in it, it might still be available to you depending on scheduling. That'll be something you need to talk to your expedition leader about.
Thank you so much. So let's talk about cameras for a second. Should I bring an expensive camera or a digital camera, or if I just have an iPhone, will that be okay for taking some good pictures on the trip?
Your iPhone's going to do wonderful. Honestly, we usually get on, we do have photo expedition, departures that do go out on this trip for those of you who are a little bit more interested in spending significant amount of time getting those landscape shots, getting those iconic views of Grand Canyon. There are departures that we have available for that, so please look into those if you're a big photography buff. I don't guide those personally, but if you're familiar with Jen and Arthur Campman, wonderful guides, wonderful photographers, and they do a really good job. um, for everyone else, I will say your iPhone's going to do really, really wonderful. If you want, that it's kind of tongue in cheek to say, but if you want that nostril view of the bighorn sheep, then you might want to bring your 200 millimeter lens. Um, that vast majority of the time, your iPhone's going to do great. And so it's going to be, kind of depending on your personal preference. If you're doing landscape shots, definitely iPhone or any kind of phone. They do have wonderful cameras. If you're really interested, like I said, in those really up close wildlife shots, you're going to want to bring your big lens. So yeah,
So
just
can
sorry, you go for it.
Now, I was just going to ask, can you elaborate a little bit more on how the photo expedition differs from the regular expedition?
Sure. Yeah. As I mentioned, I don't guide them personally. I'm rather an amateur photographer, though I practice daily. Um, but yeah, so you're gonna do a little bit less hiking, I would say. Um, but you're gonna be spending, as I mentioned, significant amount of time. So we're not moving through the landscape, talking about the flora and fauna and kind of constantly on the move, seeing as much as possible. But you're gonna get out to that spot where you get a nice view of the Grand Canyon, and you're gonna sit there until the light's right. You're gonna sit there and receive dedicated photographic instruction in regards to your camera use and to how you're going to shoot this particular scene. And you're going to be going to those I would say the biggest difference, as I mentioned, is how you're moving through the landscape, constantly on the move for a regular departure, but like going to the spot and sticking there on these photographic tours. So significant difference. If you're a lot of folks, they say, okay, well, the photographic departure fit my schedule more, and so I just went with it. I think you might be disappointed. Unless you're really focused on getting that shot, stick with our regular departure.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. So we've had a lot of questions about luggage, size, dimensions, weight. Where can we get more information on this if we're coming on the trip?
If you're coming on the trip, you're going to receive that pre-departure briefing. That's going to be your biggest resource. It's a little blue pamphlet that's got all of the very specific. I think it even has a packing list that gets into specific details. I went over some big picture stuff. Um, but that pre-departure briefing is going to be a big one for you. And then if you have any questions beyond that, reach out to your adventure specialist at the NetHab office, and they'll be able to answer those questions for you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So I know there have been some recent budget cuts at some of the parks. Does this affect NatHab's trips in any way at all?
That's a great question. Um, As I mentioned, I was in Arches and Canyonlands last week. Um, and a week before that, of course, this is a brand new itinerary. This is the first time running it. We were very concerned about this very issue. And we heard that there were 2 bathrooms open in the entire park, which is a little concerning. Um, I don't know if you all, I'm sure many of you all have been following this. There was some rehiring of a large portion of probationary staff in the national parks. And so when we actually went out to Arches, there was one pullout, one viewpoint that was closed, and everything else was open. Bathrooms were looking good. It turned out to be okay. I can't guarantee that things aren't going to change. What that will mostly look like for us is maybe, certain facilities in the national parks being closed, certain bathroom stops being closed, um, certain programming being closed. As I mentioned, I really don't know specifics for this particular area as of right now. Everything is business as usual in Zion, Bryce, and Grand Canyon, but that may change. And not expecting large changes, as far as like viewpoint closures and things like that. Um, Mostly concerned about bathrooms at this point. So, but yeah, keep updated. And if there's anything that will significantly impact our trip on the NatHab side, you will be reached out to and notified.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So, Caden, tell me, is there anything in particular that you love about this trip that you can't wait for people to see on this trip that makes it so special?
That's a great question. I um, I love the sunrises. Um, as I mentioned, I spend a significant time of my personal time down here in the desert. Um, I'm down here right now, but to make a concerted effort and to kind of go back on that Grand Canyon morning of being so early, to be with a group that values, once in a lifetime opportunities, being in the Grand Canyon and seeing the sunrise, uh, and to make a concerted, coordinated effort to have a beautiful, silent morning on the rim of the Grand Canyon or the rim of Bryce Canyon, and to start to hear the birds chirp and to start to see this orange glow on the hoodoos. I've been working for the company for 4 years, and it's still it moves me every single time. So that's what I'm most excited about. Yeah, um, that 3 a.m. sunrise or that 3 a.m. arising maybe, right, is just so worth it. And so yeah, I hope that y'all can come out with us and to see that. It is special.
Great. Thank you for sharing that, Caden. We do appreciate it. Unfortunately, that is going to be the last question that we do have time for today. So I'd like to hand it back to you for any closing comments.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, um, to kind of maybe hit on that last comment, I'm a lifelong advocate of public lands in this beautiful country. We've spent 200 years conserving the lands, especially in the West. Right, this is the heart of the Southwest. I've lived in Utah my entire life. Maybe I'll leave someday. Who knows? Maybe I won't. um, but these are beautiful places, and they're changing in a lot of different ways. And it is an utter privilege to be out here. And I thank you all for being interested in what we're doing as a company, and what we're doing, here in the webinar. So I want to thank you all for allowing me to do one of the best jobs on the planet. Um, and I really hope you can make it out with us this year or the years coming. So thank you.
And thank you, Caden, for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who joined us today. So if you are interested in information on how you can travel to see all these beautiful sites with NatHab, please give us a call at 800-543-8917, or you can send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. And if you're part of a photo club and would like NatHab to speak to your members about nature and travel photography, email us at webinars@nathab.com. Join us tomorrow for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nethab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude today's webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.